It's been quite an interesting process, I have to say.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, Frank and I have both been Twitter fanboys of you since the start of the war, or is it in end of February, I would say.
It's amazing how I never expected this to occur. Not at all.
How much?
It all came about because I said, why do we think the Russian army is any good? That's the foundation of all of this.
Via Zoom. That'd be great to see any of you. Would love to say hello to all of our ADA fellows and community members who are, hey, Marcus, good to see you. Very, very nice. All right. Great to see anybody else who's joining up. We have an exciting talk here coming today. Hey, Alberto, good to see you. You're calling in from Madrid, right? Yes, what I've heard is incredibly hot right now. So I hope you're able to get some air conditioning. We have an awesome talk coming up today here. I've got Phil O'Brien from the University of St. Andrews. I've also got Frank Sauer. We're going to give a proper intro to them in a moment. We're just going to get everybody a few moments to arrive. And while everyone is arriving, I just want to make a couple announcements. We have an exciting announcement for the Ada Lovelace Festival coming up in the middle of September. So Ada Lovelace Festival, September 15th and 16th in Berlin. I'm happy we can confirm now. Chancellor Olaf Scholz is going to be joining us there. So he's going to be on the stage on the second day. Yeah, Marcus, you give a thumbs up. You can say hi to your boss there. And we're going to be able to have some cool conversations. We'd love to have anybody there. I'm going to send that link really quick in the chat. For all of you who are Ada Fellows, of course, you can just sign up on the hub. But for anybody else who wants to join, for anybody else who is just check out, I'm not going to send it to YouTube or to LinkedIn, but for those of you who are joining us via the stream, check out the Ada Lovelace Festival. Just do a Google search. You're going to come up with the ticket shop. We'd love to have anybody there. So as we know, for all of you who are joining us here on Zoom, you can ask questions anytime. Just throw it in the chat. If you are joining us via the LinkedIn stream or the YouTube stream, feel free at any time to throw a comment or a question in, and we'll be happy to bring it in. So as you saw in the announcement, we've got a really cool talk today. We are going to be, we have live in the house right now, We have Phil O'Brien, who is an American historian. He's also a professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And as Phil was just talking about right before everyone joined, his Twitter kind of blew up in the end of February when he was basically posed the question, why did we ever think the Russian army was so good? And so he's been, Frank Sauer and I, Frank is also joining, by the way. Some of you know Frank from his last session with us a few months ago. Frank Sauer is a head of research at the Metis Institute for Strategy and Foresight. He's also with the Universität der Bundeswehr München. He's an expert on emerging technologies, especially the military applications of AI and robotics. Frank and I, we've been, I would say, fairly fanboys of Phil's work on Twitter for a while. Frank, anything you'd like to say before we get started here?
No, actually, I'm very eager to get into the questions that we've prepared for Phil. I'm super happy to be back with Ada, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So let's get going.
Awesome, Frank. Why don't you jump in with the first question there for us? And Phil, very, very happy to have you in the group here today.
Okay, cool. So at the beginning of this talk, Kimo and I thought should be talking about tactics, training, leadership, adaptability. Basically, this question that you raised before everybody joined us, why are the Russians doing so badly? And to kick us off, I'd like you, Phil, to think a bit about the differences between two terms, two types of command and control, and why they matter. More particularly, and that is of interest to a German-speaking audience familiar with the difference between Auftragstaktik and Befehlstaktik. Is it apt to describe the Ukrainian way of fighting as Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, and the Russian approach as Befehlstaktik, command tactics?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, there's a lot to unpack on this, and in many ways, I think the most interesting thing we can do, but we won't be able to do it for a while, is try and understand Ukrainian tactics after this war, because they've been, I think, quite fascinating. And if we were talking about the discussion before the people got here about why did we overrate the Russians, the other question might be why did we underrate the Ukrainians? And in many ways, that actually could be the more profound question that I've been working on some people trying to understand the analysis, and we're really working hard, not in a critical way, but we think this is a really important learning lesson. That we need to understand why we looked at this war as something, or maybe why many people looked at this war as one that the Russians were going to win very quickly and easily, and see the intellectual assumptions behind that, because actually I think that made war more likely. The fact is, not only we, but the Russians, as the phrase, they drank their own Kool-Aid and actually believed that they would get to Kiev in a week, or even less than a week, and take that. So, and part of that was, I think, not only the overrating of the Russians, but the underrating of the Ukrainians. Now, this is all in many ways quite speculative, but it really is worth doing. That when we looked at the war, the opening stages of the war, I'm not a land power person in a specialty. I specialize in air power and logistics. I mean, that's coming out of my work on the Second World War, but also in more modern war. I've been working on modern air power and modern logistics, because I think that's often stuff that doesn't get the kind of coverage that it deserves. But I was struck I think when we approached the war, when it started, that it was a very important thing to say, okay, let's cleanse our mind of our pre-assumptions. And by the way, I don't think everyone's done that yet. I still think we have this big, strong Russia vision in the back of our minds. And a lot of people have this, well, at some point, the Russians are going to be big and strong and crush Ukraine because they're Russians and that's what they do. But actually, if we try and flatten out those pre-war assumptions and just look at what we see in front of our faces, at least from a lot of open source intelligence, and again, this is not perfect intelligence, and we're dealing with some haze, we saw some very early engagements that showed one side that had a plan and could only stick to the plan. And we saw another side that could react to the plan. And we saw that right away. I think it was the Erpenbuka airfield. The Russians went in, special forces, they're going to take this airfield, definitely, no problem. And then what was really surprising was how quickly the Ukrainians reacted to that airfield being taken, and they retook it in 24 hours. Now, they didn't actually have it defended that well, from what we could tell, because the Russians got in there. But this is a small unit engagement. It wasn't the Ukrainians could react with a massive force. In fact, they were trying to defend themselves, but we saw a lot of small unit engagement that got quickly to that airfield and took it back from the Russians and inflicted some very heavy damage. And then we saw, just a few days later, as the Russians were approaching Kyiv, particularly on those drives from the east, from Kharkov and Sumy, actually the Russians, there was the famous 40-mile column, but that wasn't in many ways the interesting one. It was the other ones which came and people said were in many ways more threatening. But the Ukrainians that seemed to have a really intelligent plan of letting those columns come down the road and then allow small units to basically destroy them in place, use parts of them. And that can only be done if you have motivated small units that can take initiative on their own, because they had to be operating almost behind Russian lines without a lot of strict command and control. So this is speculative, obviously, and we're going to know more, but I think we saw right away that at least on paper, the Russians were following a plan and the Ukrainians were adapting to that plan. And the Russians had, I don't want to say found it impossible, but found it extremely difficult to adapt to the Ukrainians' adaptations. So basically, the Russians have continued to do what they're doing. Now, that in many ways makes sense when you look at it from a detached point of view, because the Ukrainians have been receiving NATO training since 2014. And this is something you probably know better than I would. They were saying 10,000 soldiers a year were receiving NATO-based training, which stresses NCO and junior officer initiative.
That would have been my next question. I mean, these smaller forces that were so capable in terms of disrupting Russian logistics and the Russian advance towards Kiev, that has something to do with mission type tactics or flat hierarchies, delegating authority to people actually doing the work in the field. Am I right?
That's what we said. I mean, that's what seems to happen. I mean, again, I don't want to say I know exactly what the Ukrainians did, but it does seem to happen that the Ukrainians have been following. They did what a smaller NATO country would do if faced with a larger force. They reacted very much in that way, and the Russians reacted very much in their traditional way in that training. And by the way, I've heard this, you might know better than I, that there's almost it's a slight repeat of Azerbaijan, Armenia. And I know people don't have, but that Azerbaijanis were trained by Turks NATO standard and showed more initiative than the Armenians, which were basically trained to Russian standard and were following sort of this command. The other thing, I don't want to jump ahead, but we can come back to it, is what's happened in the Donbass seems to reinforce the fact that the Russians simply don't have NCO initiative. They don't have these sort of NCO junior officer initiative, because they seem to be relying on just simply massive artillery to go forward. I mean, it does seem to be the tactic is blow everything up and create a void and move into the void. But then they can't then extend beyond the void. Even when they seem to have made holes in Ukrainian lines, they have absolutely no ability to exploit those holes. And that seems to be because, I mean, one would think that the lack of NCO or junior officer initiative would make a difference.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the Russians moved so many high-ranking generals towards the front lines, also lost a whole number of them, speaks to the fact that only when from the very top there's an order, things start changing and moving. And unless that's the fact, I've read the strangest examples of the Russians just trying the same thing over and over 5 or 6 times again and again, failing, but keeping the same game plan because there's no order to change tactics. And that is probably we can make out from I am with you. All of this is not great intelligence. We're piecing this together from all kinds of sources that we read on the internet and that are open source. But this is kind of how it looks. And maybe we switch gears for a second and go to one more thing that is maybe also very interesting to the people listening, and that is technology, the role of technology.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians seem so much more agile, flexible, and adaptive also with the way they use technology. For instance, there's these commercial drones that they use, quadcopters, and they 3D print tail fins for decades-old grenades that they then use to drop on tanks or Russian infantry. And it seems that they generate this from the bottom up. So it's just people in the field. It's sometimes people who before the war used to be, software engineers or did something in the tech sector, and then switched gears, were forced to, and are now innovating from the bottom up for fighting the invading forces. So what can we learn in the West from that?
That's a great question, and again, it's speculation, but I've been trying to think about this through, and I've just very preliminary ideas, and I'd love to hear actually what other people think about this. I tried to start putting them down in that article. I don't know if people have been reading some of the stuff I wrote in the Atlantic about great powerness. What is a great power? And I think and by the way, historically, we call many powers great powers that weren't. And this could be everything from Franz Joseph's Austria to Mussolini's Italy, and I would argue Putin's Russia. It's a very common thing to refer to quote unquote great powers, and then they turn out not to be great powers versus those that we would say do turn out to be great powers. And we only know when war comes. I mean, great powerness, of course, is something that it's an easy label to give at peacetime, and is very rarely analyzed. I mean, people were using the phrase great powerness about Russia and just not really basing it on anything, but they had a large army and they had nuclear weapons, and that's enough to be a great power. But actually, I think it isn't. What I think this is showing, and it's still early days, and I think it'd be great to have a conversation, is that actually great powerness, the outward manifestation is a military, but not the productive capacity underlying it. And you can't be fooled by the outward manifestation if you don't have the underlying abilities to create that military. What are the underlying strengths then of a great power? If we look at today, from 1900 to today, the number one thing is you have to be an economic technological leader. I mean, that's the ones that we would call great powers, and that would be the United States. It might be, say, Germany, 1900 to 1940. It might be Britain, 1900 to 1940s. It would be the Soviet Union from 1943 to 1980 or something like that. Actually, they foundationally were economic technological forces in the world. So that is actually the number one element to be in China today. It's when China becomes an economic technological leader that it has the ability to become a great power. Now, that's not enough, because we would say, Japan, since didn't become a great power in the post-war period when it economically, technologically could have. Germany today is, I think you can tell me, wrestling with its power status. Whereas in terms of economic technological power, Germany absolutely could be far more of a power in the world. But so it seems to me it's a three-step process. And this is, again, early days. One is the foundation is your economic technological strength. The second thing then is what I'll call the shaping factors. And that's your society, your politics, your culture, your anything which takes the economic technological power and translates it. And then the outward manifestation is the military. But looking at the military and just looking at that will not tell you. And what the Ukrainians have shown is it's far better to have an economically, technologically conversant population than a very large, shiny military with people who are not economically, technologically conversant. And Russian soldiers are not actually trained to be technologically innovative, or the Russian military. And there are a lot of high-tech people in Russia who have learned these things, but they've not actually been brought into the military. I mean, that's another thing. The military seems to be drawn from the parts of Russian society that are basically poor. If you look at the people who have died, they don't come from Moscow, they don't come from St. Petersburg, they don't come from the large technologically advanced cities. They're basically taking their poorer parts of the country and forcing them into the military, right, or enticing them in. And they're not going to be technologically conversant as others, whereas the Ukrainians are taking everybody. I mean, Ukraine has had societal mobilization, and therefore they're taking this population. So I think it's a really important point. And I think actually that is what you've talked about is the foundation of a power is not its military. The foundation is what the military is created from. And the military is simply a manifestation.
Yeah, and I mean, we've learned from for instance, downed Russian drones that they're using, chips from Western manufacturers. The tanks, the more advanced tanks that they're using are using electro-optics from France, and so on and so forth, which suggests that if these sanctions actually work, that in the mid to long term, Russia will be cut off from any sort of high-tech industrial armament space, and just be not in a position to develop all those things on their own. And then obviously the big question is what is China going to do in that regard? But only as a small tangent, Kimo and I, when we were preparing for this, we were sort of half joking, just as a mental exercise for everyone on the call, go back like through your own life and think back to the large juggernaut companies that once were, and people thought, well, this is a great power company. Basically, this is the big, they're making the high tech thing that everybody wants, and poof, all of a sudden they're gone, like Atari or I don't know, Kodak,
IBM.
So there's maybe there's a lesson to draw from also, and if you live more in the economic rather than the political realm, like the two of us do. But Kimo, maybe you want to jump in at this point.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in with a couple of points, because one of the questions that I had was how much of this advantage is really amplified by the fact that the Ukrainians get to fight on home turf, and so they get the entire society and all of its potential technological base to basically chip in with very close connection to the front lines. And maybe as a connected question, I draw in something that just came from David, who's chiming in. He's with the Swiss government, and he's basically asking, okay, look at the number of planes landing to deliver military supplies to Ukraine. How much does that make the difference here?
Well, certainly, Ukrainian resistance without Western military supplies would be far less than it is. On the other hand, Ukraine was also starved of Western military supplies before the war. So, it's a double-edged sword. Had Ukraine had the systems they have now been given to them before the war, actually the war would be over by now. I think the Russian army would be in such bad shape that it would be hard to see how it could continue. So yes, we were really talking about a military that was going to get by on manpads, old Russian artillery, old Russian anti-air, and old Russian planes. And that's what they went into the war with mostly. They didn't have NATO standard weapons. So yes, it's very important that they have the NATO standard weapons to resist, but the amazing thing is they're actually integrating them on the go. I don't think I know, and I would look at a historical example, and I'd love to hear if other people can come up with one, a military changing its equipment standard in the middle of a war in the early phases. Really just transforming its equipment standard and learning new systems on the hoof. So I would say that's a double, at that point is an interesting and very important, but also it's one we could look at from a number of different perspectives. And I think it's important. Now, the first part, what was your first part? I've lost the
the first part was the question of how much is this, we talk about this technological initiative advantage of the Ukrainians, and how much of that comes from them being able to fight on home turf, where they're able to bring the entire society in immediately into the conflict to work with these kind of innovations, 3D print fins for mortar rounds, dropping up drones, those kinds of things.
Well, I think, and made worse by Russian behavior. Mm. I don't know what the Russian-speaking population of, say, the Donbass and Kharkiv would have been like had the Russians come in differently, but the Russians came in committing war crimes right and left and killing people, and that's provided, I think, a massive impetus to society that seems to have sort of drawn. Ukrainian nationalism has got to be much stronger today than it was on February 23rd, and a lot of that has been Russian created. in the way they've done that. The other thing about Ukrainian, I mean, Ukrainian is fully societally mobilized, and a lot of people who didn't want to be there got out. I mean, people could see this coming, and so those who didn't want to fight the war, a lot of them did get out and left in February and all of that. So if you stayed, you probably were willing to fight, and you didn't want to. So that they do have that kind of committed force. So I think these are all advantages, and these are force multipliers. But the foundational thing is the Ukrainians decided they didn't want to be ruled by Putin. Their society was such they did not wish to be ruled by Vladimir Putin's Russia, and they're willing to do what they can do to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's the greatest advantage they have.
Yeah, Frank, did you want to take off the next question there?
Yeah, just a thought maybe. I mean, it's not only that the people who wanted to fight stayed, they also made it very hard for fighting age males to leave the country. Then again, you know, Ukraine has just been attacked. I've been in this conversation a couple of times, and people are quite upset about this. In Germany, for instance, they're saying like, well, they're not letting the men leave. What if they don't want to fight? And I'm like, yeah. I mean, it's tough, but look at, you know, the German Grundgesetz, and look at what happens if Germany, God forbid, gets attacked one time by some country. There's a lot in store there. So it's just people need to, I think, understand what a terrible situation Ukraine is in, and what an emergency situation it really is. And hence, there's just no good solution to anything. It's just the perpetual choosing between, you know, two very bad situations, trying to find the lesser evil. Yeah. Maybe since we're talking about, say, us, meaning, you know, Europe, Western Europe, in terms of resilience, maybe are there more lessons that we can draw from this? Also, I know this is not necessarily your specialty, so I wouldn't want to press you on this, but for instance, the whole cyber aspect of the war, like, is there something that you find interesting to ponder in that regard?
There's two things on resilience and cyber. Those are both really big points. I mean, I'm going to be probably a little counterintuitive now. I think what this proves is actually Europe has a window of opportunity to do it properly, because Russia's not going to be a threat to Europe for a long time. The Russian military is getting decimated on the battlefields of Ukraine. And what Russia doesn't have the ability, by the way, which was pointed out, they don't have an ability to build up a new advanced one that quickly. Because actually, what is, say, different from an earlier industrial war is that usually the sides have the ability to ramp up production as war goes on. But Russia actually doesn't have that ability to, say, ramp up advanced tank or aircraft production in a fast way. So they're going to come out of this war in whatever happens, the Russian military is going to come out of this war in disastrously weakened short-term position. So Europe does have an ability. I think, on the other hand, what has happened is the assumption that, oh, we will always get along and they wouldn't really do this, and we don't have to worry about a militarized Russia, which I think was underpinning a lot of people's thoughts for 15 years. I mean, they really wouldn't do this, of course. We're all reasonable people. That now is gone. So when Europe has, I would say, a window to make the right choices on defense. I mean, I wouldn't rush to spend, I know, well, we must do all this. Well, no, make the right choices. Actually learn from this war what worked or what didn't. Just early on in the war, everyone's saying, tanks, we need more tanks, we need more tanks. Well, do we? What are we actually going to learn about what is effective or not ineffective in this war? So the lessons are positive and negative for Europe. Europe has a window. It has an extraordinary window to come out of this, the planet. It's whether it chooses that window properly. I think when it comes, now Europe could choose very properly and be in a very secure position. I mean, the dream scenario is you end up with a situation where Ukraine, in a sense, is given enough aid to come out of the war in really good shape, joins the European Union. What happens to Belarus and Russia? I mean, you could actually have a transformative situation where the European Union extends to Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia has friendly relations, in which case European security in a traditional military sense is transformed, but we don't know. The cyber one is interesting. I mean, I'm part of a cyber group that has been met a lot before the war and during the early phases, but we've been also so busy to sort of get back to it. A few things came out on cyber. One, the Russians tried a lot of it, but they couldn't get it done. So it wasn't that cyber was not as important as people thought. On the one hand, I think the Russians might have been overrated in their cyber capacity, probably because we confused, again, Russian success in information warfare with Russia being a cyber power. And actually, cyber power is a lot of different things. It's becoming that thing where maybe the phrase doesn't work. Russia showed it had extraordinary sophisticated abilities to manipulate information warfare before the war, from interfering in people's politics, from getting the lines across and getting the message across that they wanted. That's very different from translating it to a more aggressive militarized use of cyber to say shut down systems in a military way. So they did try it from what we could tell, but they couldn't bring it in, and we don't know to what degree Ukraine was helped also to oppose that. The other thing I heard is when push comes to shove, people have preferred to maintain the intelligence advantage they gained from cyber rather than turning it into an aggressive form of warfare. And this again, who knows? We're not going to know this until long after the war. But actually maintaining the systems as a means of intelligence IRT is more important than, say, blowing up. You'd rather track the Russian rail system or track the Ukrainian rail system than disrupt it right away. Or you needed it. I mean, that was the other thing. The Russians were actually, in the first phase, they didn't attack Ukrainian mobile communications because they needed it to communicate. Their basic assumption was they would take the country over so quickly, they wouldn't need to sabotage certain cyber systems. So cyber might not have worked quite as clearly or cleanly as people said, oh, cyber was overrated. Cyber was different and cyber is more complex. But there is a lot of cyber that's going on, and I think particularly in intelligence gathering.
Yeah. And also in terms of cyber operations actually inflicting damage or trying to disrupt Ukrainian resistance, the Ukrainians again had a lot of help. There was a couple of interesting pieces, I think, in the New York Times about how the Americans particularly were just super quick in terms of staving off this attack, which did happen, but it had not the intended effect. And on the information operations thing, we tend to be navel gazing a bit too much, I think, in that respect. One of the things that is currently happening, and we're not taking maybe enough notice of that, is that the Russian information operation reach is just, targeted at different regions. We're not really, I mean, in a sense, Europe is kind of, a lost cause for them at this point, but they're targeting large parts of Africa, India, China, Brazil. And I mean, we have, and we should have, for instance, in Germany, very lively debate in terms of, what to do about the war. And I'm going to go into this in a second. But these countries aren't as clear cut on the issue, like at all. They're at best fence sitting, seeing, let's see how this turns out. And then, see where we can go with this. But it's not clear to, large parts of the rest of the world that Russia is the aggressor here.
Yep.
And Russia is, of course, helping getting that message across, and that's what they're doing right now. But
absolutely, I mean, Russia has been probably the most successful information warfare power of the last 15 years. Yeah, they've really done a good job on it, and they are doing an increasingly good job outside of Europe and North America, and places like Japan and Korea, and getting that message out. So yes, I mean, as you're saying, and parts of Africa and South Asia, the Russian narrative is in fact more normal than the non-Russian narrative. I was surprised how strong it was in India. The one problem is actually what matters for them in the war in Ukraine in the short term is keeping weapons out of Ukraine, and they have to win the information war in NATO for that. And they're not winning the information war in the one place where really matters for the aid going to Ukraine.
Yeah, which takes me back to this picture the EU painted of the European security architecture of the future, and maybe a Ukraine that is very close to the EU, maybe a EU member, and generally speaking, much more friendly relations in the long run. And I would say, but some people I think confuse is that that is actually the goal also of those people who say we should be helping Ukraine with everything we've got. It's just that for a time being, the way to organize security in Europe is no longer the way we tried it for the last 30 years with Russia, but rather, unfortunately, due to Putin's decision to attack Ukraine, against Russia, also with regard to, you know, all the Central and Eastern European countries. I mean, in a sense, you know, the Baltic countries always warned us, and they were right, and we were wrong. You could boil it down and say it's as simple as that. Especially us Germans, we need to be asking ourselves with regard to a couple of, you know, decisions of the past, Nord Stream, etc., etc. But the goal is, of course, even though we have this window of opportunity in Europe to strengthen our defenses and to, you know, and Finland and Sweden joining NATO is, of course, a big, big piece in that overall puzzle. The goal is, of course, to once again get to a point where you can have, you know, proper arms control with Russia, proper risk mitigation measures, diplomacy, and so on and so forth. This is the goal. The goal cannot be and is not to like North Koreanize Russia and totally contain them. That's not even possible. That's not possible at all. And so this is like the sensible goal to be able to talk to Russia again, but from a position not of energy dependency, but strength.
Entirely. I mean, my optimistic mind says hopefully a generational change in Russia might make a difference. I mean, we're still dealing with the Soviet Union generation. Putin's generation is a Soviet Union trained, has a particular outlook on the world. People, many of them who've left Russia in the last year, the last few months, you know, people in their 20s and 30s seem to have a very different outlook, potentially. And there's no, in many ways, we can try and engage with a younger Russian generation going forward after this war. I don't think this leadership will be that easy to engage with, because I think this leadership is so attached. But I agree completely. You don't want a perma war with Russia. I mean, by the way, Russia economically can't take a perma war either. I mean, at some point, the reality of what the Russian government has done to itself will have to percolate through. And one hopes that perhaps a different tone will come through. And the German question is interesting. I mean, I'd like to hear from your point of view, but it does seem to me that the security architecture of Europe is now in some ways being driven by the Baltics, certain Eastern European states, and the Scandinavians. The old traditional German France sort of powerhouse of Europe and making a lot of the decisions, but actually it does seem to be the Baltics with Poland, with Czechia, with Finland and Sweden now in both NATO and the EU, and Norway and NATO, that actually they're playing an increasingly assertive role in trying to, and that they're not waiting on Germany, they're not waiting on France, but they're actually driving the pace. But I don't know if that's how it's seen from Germany.
No, I think, yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, we will see how it all shakes out.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, in the end, Germany, simply due to its geographic position, is just so important in terms of logistics and everything. And here's my point of view. When I talk to people outside of Germany, all over Europe, they're all looking at us and they're saying, please, this Zeitenwende thing that you're doing, are you actually doing this? Because we're all depending on this, on you actually coming through. And so this is kind of the way that I look at it, like that we've got so much catching up to do, simply in terms of being the hub that everybody wants us to be. And we're quite far away from this still, and we have only a couple of years to, you know, do this ginormous reform. But before we get, you know, too ahead of ourselves, and please, Kimo, interrupt us and maybe even throw in a couple of questions from the audience. But I have one more thing. Before we go, you know, deep into the future, what is your expectation for the next couple of months? Because this is, of course, what we're also from a German point of view. Again, I'm sorry, but which we're, you know, quite concerned about with the gas prices and all these kinds of things. And I'm worried that we will kind of, you know, fall into Putin's trap in a sense that we are as weak and, you know, as lame as he, you know, claims us to be, because, you know, we only have 19 degrees in our flats, and so all of a sudden, like, we don't want any more of this war, and can't we find a solution to this so that we can have cheap gas again? Which probably, you know, might be nice, but in the short run, but in the mid and long term would be a ginormous strategic mistake. So how do you think the war is going, and how do you think also Western support for Ukraine will develop over the next couple of months?
Big questions. All right. On the war, I think the general trajectory has actually been the same for about, well, I don't want to say since February 24th, but basically the trajectory has been the same since March, when NATO countries made the decision that they were actually going to start sending significant aid to Ukraine. And that general trajectory, it's taking time, is that Ukraine is getting better and better systems. We see it most recently and publicly with the HIMARS, but actually they're getting better systems across the board. And the Russian military is getting more stuff out of storage because they can't make new stuff, and those systems are less good. Now, the Russians still have more. So they still have mass, and they're going to have the mass advantage. But actually, Russian ability to dominate operations is going to an increasingly small area. I mean, really, they've been putting almost all their offensive capability into an area not much bigger than Greater Berlin for the last 2 months. And the Ukrainians have been getting stronger. They've been getting better systems. So at some point, I think the Russians will actually lose the ability to do almost all offensive operations, except in very small areas where they can concentrate a lot of force. And we don't even know if logistically they could keep it up. I mean, we won't know, but to do the story of Russian truck losses and Russian rail lines coming out, because the Russian way of war is in some ways Second World War. I mean, what we're looking at is Stalin's rail lines meeting up with trucks with mass amounts of goods. So I do think the Russian ability to go forward will end relatively soon. They might be able to do 1 or 2 limited. Then the question is, can the Ukrainians drive them back? And that's a very difficult proposition. The thing the Ukrainians will have going for them is I'm not sure the Russian army will behave very well to losing initiative and being stuck in place. I mean, being stuck in place with a system against a country which has an accuracy advantage. I mean, Ukraine doesn't have the numerical advantage, but it has the range and accuracy advantage. And that will grow as it gets more of these systems, from the HIMARS, but to the Panzerhaubitze, to the Krabs. Supposedly they love the Polish Krabs too. That they have a range of these systems that are just more accurate and on the whole longer range than the Russians. It might not be great to be a Russian soldier in an army that is not able to go forward and have to suffer from more selective attacks. So really the Ukrainian advantage might be, I'm not sure this Russian army is going to be too excited to be there in that kind of situation going forward. But that's not to say it'll be easy for the Ukrainians to drive the Russians back. I think it will be, we're talking about potentially a very, very difficult campaign. The opinion stuff is interesting because I've done some work. Actually, I've done some of the stuff I've written about is American public opinion and war. And I'd like to actually have a discussion with you about European public opinion and whether it's different. The American public opinion on war, the reality is very different than the way people think it is. And by the way, this is done on a lot of really good academic research going back to the First World War, Second World War, on up, Vietnam and whatever. Everyone, the United States loses interest in wars, or they react to casualties in wars. Actually, that's not true. They don't lose interest in wars, and they don't really care about casualties. It's rather, cynical. They care about victory. The number one motivating factor, if your American population is going to stay supportive for a war, it's whether the United States or the side they're rooting for can seem to be winning. And so when, say, the Vietnam is the fascinating example. For people would write who didn't do the research, Vietnam, the United States turned against the Vietnam War when all the bodies came back, and body bags and US casualties went up. Actually, that's not true. They turned against the Vietnam War very quickly in 1968 when they realized it wasn't winnable. After Tet, it wasn't like it was sort of this body bag thing. It was a winnability thing, and that seemed to, by the way, be repeated in both Iraq and Afghanistan. In the post 9/11 world, that there was a lot of U.S. support when they were seen as easy, triumphant wars, flag waving, pull down the statue of Saddam Hussein, and then it wasn't casualties that turned the American population. It was, this is a quagmire, we can't win. And I think we're seeing that a bit on the Ukrainian narrative, that certainly from the American point of view, the population's interest in the war and willingness to support Ukraine isn't one about, oh, they're going to get bored and move on. It's whether it's considered winnable by Ukraine. And I think that's it. Now, I don't know if that translates well to Europe. That seems to be the way the American population adjusts to war. And maybe the European population is quite different and will react to different impulses. But I will actually defer to you or other people who want to talk about that from the European point of view, because I'm not expert on that. And I've not studied it in the way that I've studied the American population.
Yeah, so the answer to your question, I unfortunately only can give like anecdotally speaking, and I would say like the number one motive in the German debate is peace. And I think the differences are in the perceived way to achieve that peace. Like we have these open letters by people who say we need to have basically an diplomatic offensive rather than a military offensive. We need to stop giving them weapons. It only kills more people. Why don't we find a way to negotiate peace now? And then there's the other bunch of people that says, well, Putin is simply not interested in negotiating. And even if we find some sort of settlement now, it'll only encourage him to, in 3 to 5 years, do the same thing all over again. Like now's the time. And Ukraine, as you say, even though it might be challenging, but at least is in a position now and might be in a position to stop the Russians and also create a situation for the Russians that, prevents them from doing something like that again and again and again, the way they did over the last years, where the West, frankly, did not really react to this unless the gas was flowing. Now, of course, the problem really is that we create this future. Like, we don't know really. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy if we stop giving weapons to the Ukrainians that Russia will in the end prevail because of mass. Well, if we give them the Panzerhaubitze 2000, etc., and they do have the advantage in range and precision, then mass might not matter so much. So that is, I think, a problem for most people to live and make decisions in this constant uncertainty about what future it is that we're heading into. We are also, in the end, the Ukrainians decide. Yeah. That is key. And Putin could stop this war now. But we can also do things, but we need to be aware of the fact that we have some influence, and so we can change the shape of the future, but we're not the all-deciding factor. Which leads me to a final question. And again, Kimo, please interrupt us. And that would be I would count you as one of the optimists, together with maybe Elliot Cohn and a few other people. And I'd say so far so good. I think a lot of your take turned out to be the right take in many ways. But what if it goes horribly?
I froze for a minute there, but I'm back. Sorry.
Yeah. I was kind of yeah. You're back.
I mean, I was, if it goes horribly wrong for Ukraine.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, two things. People have called me an optimist, but actually, I've tried not to be. And I've actually tried to see what I see. What I've tried not to do is look with any preconceptions. So, I mean, I know it might sound to some people that I'm being optimistic. I don't think I'm being optimistic. I'm trying to actually say what I see on the ground in terms of the military forces from what we can see. And then in terms of motivation, reaction, ability to adjust, actually, it does seem to me one side is fighting smarter. And on the whole, when it comes to a war, the side that fights smarter does better in the long run. So I would just gently push back on the notion that I'm being optimistic, because I don't think I'm being optimistic. I hope I'm being actually honest in the way. If it goes terribly wrong, I don't know how. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean the Ukrainian army gives up? Or, I mean, that I don't know how it could go. Wars go the way they go. Yeah, MES command makes a decision, but at this point, the Ukrainian army is what it is. The Russian army is what it is. I'm not sure we're going to see a Ukrainian collapse. Where the Russians haven't shown the ability to do any kind of sort of fast armored exploitation. So what could be bad? I mean, the bad thing for Ukraine is Russia has, in a sense, carves out all the Donbass that it can and sets up a defensive perimeter. And it ends up being a real nasty slog for the Ukrainians, and they can't break through coming back. and Russia, in a sense, annexes what it holds now with a little more. That would, I think, be the bad scenario for Ukraine. And that is a possibility if the Russians fight in a very motivated, intelligent way, and if they're willing to accept years of sanctions. They would have to then have the Ukrainians be willing to cede that territory to them. And there's one thing, I don't see Russia conquering Ukraine. That's done. The idea that I think that people went into on February 24th, that Ukraine would be conquered, and that was the general narrative. Ukraine was doomed. I just don't see how Ukraine is conquered. They've added about 10-12% of Ukraine to what they had before. They have about 20% of Ukraine, but they had 10% of it before. So they actually haven't added that much more of Ukraine. It's hard to see how they can get much beyond where they are now. So it becomes a question about whether Ukrainian, opinion changes. And one thing that's just interesting about, and I'm wondering if this is where the double-edged sword. Imagine everything we say about Ukraine was said about the Vietnamese or the Afghanis. The Vietnamese will give up, or that people who want to fight for national independence usually are willing to put up with a heck of a lot. We'll look at what the Vietnamese, what the Afghanis have put up with for decades and decades. People struggle if they actually do have a national identity and they're willing to fight with it. Why are we assuming after 3 or 4 months the Ukrainians might accept a crappy peace? I mean, I would think Ukraine is probably more united in this war now than it was in January, and more likely to willing to play the long one. I mean, the Russians are the ones who are actually showing reluctance to go for the long war. Putin won't admit what this is. He won't mobilize. He's still having a fiction that this is some sort of special operation, that the Russians are being greeted as liberators, and this is all going according to plan. So they're not being honest with their own population, I think, about what we're seeing. So it's more likely the Russians will have that problem, because if you're not being honest with your own people about what this war is, you're the one who's afraid about their opinion. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure the Ukrainians could be any more aware of what this war is than they are now.
Kind of following up on that point, we had a question come in earlier from Marcus, who's one of our fellows from the Bundesregierung, and he's kind of teasing something that goes right into this thread right here. I'll read his question directly, and then we'll maybe interpret it based on what you were talking about here, because he asks, how would an artificial intelligence decide on the continuation of the war from the Ukrainian perspective? Could the war be won, or should losses be cut? And as you were talking now, you're talking about all of these somewhat intangible factors about national passion, about the kind of the maybe we would call them in traditional ways, non-rational factors that shape the outcome of a war. So how would you tease between those two, between what we're really seeing and what people might idealize as a purely rational way to judge the continuation of this war?
Oh, I mean, it's a great question. And I know certainly you could make a very rational case that if Ukraine actually believes it has a weak identity and the population will lose the willingness to fight, that they would cut a deal right now, basically giving the Russians what they have. And they would still have 80% of their country. They might have EU membership. That if they really believe their population isn't willing to suffer, and that those who are willing to live under Russian occupation will live under Russian occupation, and the West will give up with sanctions, and the sanctions will be lessened, then you could absolutely make a rational case. I mean, it's all based on the willingness to resist. Now, right now, Ukrainian willingness to resist seems pretty strong. And they seem to be willing to pay the price of the war. In that case, that's up to them. Again, I'm not a Ukrainian expert. All I can see is a war in front of me and see the way the war seems to be developing. But right now, they seem to be willing to fight with greater societal mobilization than the Russians. It's not perfect. A lot of Ukrainians have left, and a lot of Ukrainians don't want to fight and die. But they certainly seem to have enough who are willing to fight to make the larger Russian army suffer, and indeed, I think, bog the Russian army down. By any other perspective, I mean, this is a disaster in imperial warfare. If we look at what the Russians have tried to do, they've launched an invasion. with the quote unquote second or third largest army in the world. They've taken only a small part of the country they tried to take. They seem to be able to move glacially slowly, kilometer or two a day where they put all their force, and they have no ability to conquer that entire country. If you change the names and didn't say Russia, Ukraine, but just say country A and country B, we would all say country A, Russia, is in a catastrophically bad situation.
And it managed to unify all the powers arranged to keep country A in check. You know, that's a disaster.
Finland and Sweden entering NATO.
Yeah, exactly.
The way that they have had to accept Finland, this was always considered a red line. No way, Finland will never be in NATO. And then they just, well, Finland's in NATO, and what can you do about it? So
maybe one more thing that when observing the way discourse is going, I find interesting is that in terms of the utilitarian, super high rational view on the conflict and then other things kicking in, we are in a way in parts unable to stomach really what's going on, because we've been living in this post-heroic society for so long. There are actually people, smart people, so I don't take this the wrong way, in German talk shows saying, you know, what we need is peace. We've got so much bigger problems in the world, like, you know, the climate crisis. And I'm like, I mean, yeah, you are correct, but this is simply not, you know, on the top of the agenda of Ukrainian people literally fighting for their lives after Bucha and so on and so forth. So we have a weird tendency of also projecting what we'd be doing or what we'd be expecting in a situation like this onto Ukraine. And, you know, in that regard, also on the last question in terms of what could go wrong and the picture that you drew, I think that is actually one that we're not fully aware of yet, that there simply might not be like a long-lasting or like a good peaceful solution to this. This war simply might not end for many, many years, because we will find ourselves in some sort of stalemate, kind of like the way it was after 2014, like some contact line. Also, like there's guerrilla fighting already in occupied territories. So Russia will have to deal with that for years to come. And then, you know, imagine Putin, who has the goal of not, you know, having Ukraine slip away towards the West, well, a divided country in basically in a permanent state of frozen conflict / war, where he can dial up the thermostat as he wishes, together with the gas. That's perfect for him. Why would he even sit down and negotiate, you know, peace in that regard? And because that would be like, of course, that would be very bad for everyone.
That's where the sanctions, I know Russia's made a lot of money from selling oil, but actually it's not a productive economy, and these sanctions are hitting, and they've had a 5 to 6% GDP fall already as the projected one. They can't have a permanent war with these sanctions, because I think that would be so destructive to the long-term development of the Russian economy. Russia will have to reach a deal at some point, simply to try and re-enter the European world and trade with Europe. You can't have this kind of broken thing. But I think it's more whether, and so that I'm one of those who can't see it going 4 to 5. I just can't see that either side. I mean, where's Russia also going to generate the soldiers to keep this war up for that many years? So it will be a permanent war or a long-term war. If it is, that's a nightmare. I mean, in that sense, if that scenario occurs, Russian society is more, and the Russian society and economy is more resilient and military than it seems right now to do, and people will still be volunteering. Now, we think about wars. It's interesting about wars. People volunteer like in 1914 or 1939 or 41 in America, but actually very few wars are won on volunteers. Yeah, there is a rush to the flags to begin with, and people sign up, but that blows over very quickly. And usually, if you're going to fight a long war, it's a conscript war. So Russia's going to have to go down the conscript route. I mean, they're right now doing everything possible not to do that. They're offering money. They're trying to get people to enlist. That's not going to work in a long war, and it never does. Not Russia. No society actually runs a volunteer army in a long war. So that means Russia's going to have to go full mobilization. And they're going to have to sign up all the people and say, not only are you going into the army, you're going to go to combat where we tell you to. Until they're willing to do that, there won't be a long war. So that would be the sign. If they're willing to make that change in the way they're trying to generate force, then they could fight a long war, and that would be a very tricky situation for Putin to do.
Frank, it looks like you have a good trigger now for the doom clock. if that goes, we can bring your pessimism up a notch.
Nobody wants that.
Phil, we've come to the end of the time here. First of all, Phil, I wanted to thank you so much for making the time to speak to our audience, for answering questions from our audience. We still had a few more I wish we had time to answer, but I really appreciate all the work that you've been doing to give your interpretation, to share your thoughts so much on Twitter. I would encourage anybody to follow you there. I would also love to see the work that's coming out that you were hinting at on what it really takes to be a great power, and that kind of debate and discussion that's shaping up what I hope is the next book to come from you. So thank you so much. We've gotten thanks from the audience who thought this was a really excellent interview. Frank, thank you so much for carrying so much of the questions while I was handling on the community side. I really appreciate the format. I really appreciate the time that both of you have taken with us today.
And by the way, that Kimo, you and Frank have my email. So if anybody in the crowd has any questions, ask Frank or Kimo for my email, and just send me an email.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much, Phil.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.